They said the desert would chew me up. They said no one wanted this patch of scrub and stone, that any fool who tried to live out here would crawl back to town sunburned and broke. But when I slid the deed across the counter at the Mojave County Recorder's office and watched the clerk stamp it with a date and an official seal, something steady clicked into place inside me, like a gear finally catching. My name looked wild and right on that paper. Juniper Voss. The clerk, older woman, penciled eyebrows, and a kindness that didn't waste itself, studied me over the glass partition. "You sure about the eastern boundary? It kisses BLM land. People get lost out there." "I'm sure," I said. My voice surprised me. No wobble. No apology. Behind me, Dawson Pike, the agent who'd handled the foreclosure auction, made a show of checking his watch. He had a sun-fed tan that overpromised competence, and a habit of grinning with his teeth while his eyes measured resale value. "Nobody wants that worthless wash, Juniper. But hey, congratulations on owning the county's most scenic tumbleweed. If you change your mind, I've got 3 offers for the parcel west of yours, with water." I turned just enough to meet his eyes. I didn't ask for water. He laughed like I told a joke. "Sure, nobody does." I folded the crisp deed into the envelope, thanked the clerk, and pushed through the glass door into a heat you could lean on. The courthouse steps baked my soles, the railing burned my palm. Out on the square, the old neon motel sign clicked in the bright morning, half its tubes dead, a blue swallow frozen mid-dive. The kind of towns that kept its past like a refrigerator magnet, faded, sentimental, practical. My truck waited with the patience of something I'd built instead of bought. It used to be a utility company rig before I found it at a county auction, the kind of square-shouldered beast that makes a certain kind of man explain gear ratios to you. I'd welded a rack for solar on the bed, bolted a toolbox across the back, packed it with things that made me feel less alone. A coil of rope, a dented coffee thermos, a well-oiled shovel, a pry bar, a battered metal detector, lent by a pawn shop owner who liked my stubborn streak. I climbed in and pulled away before Dawson's shadow reached my fender. The highway slid out like a gray ribbon. Saguaro stood like stoic ushers. Creosote released that after-rain incense, even though the sky was a hard blue. Out here, the horizon keeps its secrets until you earn them. I rolled down both windows and let the wind slap the courtroom smell out of my hair. I'd pieced the money together painfully, selling my last drone rig, the one I used to survey real estate for men who wore venture capital smiles and called wilderness inventory. I'd mapped other people's promises until I knew the land better than they ever would, knew how arroyos twist their knives, how a dry lake keeps a memory of the last storm in a salt scab shimmer, how a stand of desert willow can mean the hint of an aquifer 10 meters down and a century old. Knowing made me dangerous to my own excuses, so I stopped making them. Mile marker 77 flashed by. I turned onto a caliche road that pretended it wasn't pretending. The truck rattled and sang. Mesquite scratched the doors like a cat testing the door to leave. 10 minutes in, the land unfolded the way a person does when you quit interrupting it. First a shallow wash, braided with hoof prints, then a basalt spur the maps called Toccoa Ridge, then my boundary fence, 3 tired strands of barbed wire and a corner post with the top splintered like a badly cut cigar. Someone had spray-painted a skull on the post years ago. Dust and wind had blurred it into an almost face. My face today. A little wrecked, still grinning. I parked where an old cattle gate sagged, lifted the loop off the top, heaved the gate aside until its hinge pin squealed surrender, and drove through onto my land. Saying it out loud felt like testing a prayer. My land. The parcel spread like a question no one had answered yet. 40 acres of mixed gravel and hard panned, a low shoulder of rock shouldering toward the ridge, a pale valley floor where flash floods stitched temporary rivers after summer monsoons, sage, rabbit brush, beavertail cactus with magenta scars from last spring's blooms. If you were lazy, you'd call it empty. If you were paying attention, It buzzed. I killed the engine. The silence that followed had its own weather. You don't notice the wind's pitch until the motor quits. You don't notice your own pulse until the wind does. A hawk traced a loop high above me, and then another, pretending to be casual. "You and me both," I said, shading my eyes, "looking for something worth the trouble." I took the shovel and the metal detector from the bed and slung my canteen over my shoulder. The detector wasn't much. Foam padding half pulled from the headband, faceplate fogged from years, a scratch where somebody had tried to pry it open with a screwdriver. But the pawnshop owner, a woman named Hester with forearms like braided cable, had shrugged and said, "It sings when it sees truth. That's all the tool owes you." I started a grid, because if you're going to let hope drive, you at least put lines on the road. North to south across the flat, then east to west up the shallow fan at the base of the ridge. The detector hummed its thin bee hum. It chirped at pull tabs, warbled at screws, threw a triumphant tantrum at a rusted horseshoe thin as a wafer. I pocketed the horseshoe because I respect jokes that survive this long. The sun climbed. Heat pooled in the low places. Sweat stung my eyes and then dried, leaving salt like a map in the hollows of my collarbones. I found a buckle so old that it wore a perfect oval around it in the dirt, an ancient .22 shell that glittered when I spit-polished it and held it to the light, a bullet flattened into a coin by the mercy of a rock. The desert kept giving me evidence of the people who'd called it worthless. Around noon, I climbed the basalt shoulder to catch a breeze and fell in love with my land from a height. From up here you could see how the shallow wash wasn't shallow at all, but a braided history of water, how the pale patch at the valley floor wasn't death, but an old lake bed drawn like a chalk circle, how the ridge to the east wore a seam of red stone like a ribbon, a marker. The surveyor's map had mentioned an historic marker cairn somewhere near the seam, an old boundary pile from when the railroad ran supply lines through here, and men in wool coats tried to convince investors that sagebrush was just a kind of crop. I found the cairn by feel more than sight. The first rock I nudged with my boot had a human stubbornness to it. The second, underneath, had been placed to lock the first. The third wore the varnish of 100 years. I crouched to study the base and saw the old iron pin driven like a promise into the earth, the odd-top mushroomed by hammer blows, the surface stamped with a number and a date faint as a ghost. 1911.
"Hello," I told the pin. "I'm new here, but I'll try to do right by you." I drank water, ate the smashed peanut butter sandwich I'd wrapped in wax paper, and told myself I didn't mind Dawson's laugh still sitting in my ear like a mosquito. I didn't buy this land to spite anybody. I bought it because stubborn hope runs in my blood. My grandfather had been a lineman back when stringing power across the Mojave made people accuse you of sorcery. He taught me how to read a landscape, not just what was there, but what it was trying to become if you gave it half a chance. "A boundary is a story people agree to," he used to say, hands in the creases of a paper map. "The ground has its own story. Don't make it smaller." The wind shifted cooler. Clouds built in soldier rows over the far ranges, a July habit that could mean nothing or could mean violent grace by afternoon. I stood, brushed dust from my knees, and followed the red seam along the ridge's flank. The basalt here was friable, broken into flakes by centuries of heat and cold. Between them, the seam spilled pieces of a different rock, briquetted jasper, some agate, one ridiculous lump that looked like candy and made me laugh out loud in an empty place. That's when I saw the pipe. It was only an inch of rust, a circle half swallowed by gravel where the seam shouldered down to flat. I would have missed it if the sun hadn't wired a single glint along its edge as the cloud cover thinned. I crouched and brushed pebbles away with the side of my hand. The pipe was wider than a fence post, maybe 6 inches across, and cut off nearly flush with the ground. The top was capped with something once flat that time had chewed, no markings that I could see, no reason for it to be here. A lot of the desert is pretending. People drive trash into a wash and call it a dump. Companies drill test wells and call them secrets. Prospectors tap a vein, get spooked, and bury their fear under a rock nobody else will think to lift. The difference between litter and a message is the intention in the hand that left it. I dug my fingers into the gravel around the pipe and felt how the stones changed, looser, then less so, then tight again, like a ring that doesn't belong to the finger wearing it. I levered the shovel under the edge of the cap and pried. The sound it made was part surrender, part hiss. The smell that came out wasn't rot or oil or water. It was air from a different year. I rocked the cap free and lifted it slowly. Inside, darkness. Then the dull wink of metal. "Hello again," I told the desert. My voice sounded different, thinner, younger. I sat back on my heels and breathed until the roaring in my ears diluted to wind. I snapped a photo with my phone because I've learned that memory, no matter how stubborn you think it is, will slip its leash when awe walks in. Then I slid the shovel's blade into the hole to feel for edges, for sides. The shovel clinked against something that wasn't earth, traveled another inch, then stopped like it had hit a lip. Not a pipe, a sleeve. I widened the hole with the shovel, circling the pipe and easing stones away until I could work both hands down beside the sleeve. The ground here had been disturbed before, but long ago. Hands that did hard work had done this. The sleeve's rim was smooth beneath the rust, like something machined by a person who wanted it to last. 6 bolts once held the cap tight. 3 were gone. 3 had sheared and left crescent moons. I leaned farther in until half my torso disappeared, braced my toes against rock, gripped the interior lid and tugged. Something gave, a suction pop, then a slow lift. Below the lid, the darkness wasn't empty. I squinted as my pupils fought to make sense of dull shapes, corners, impossible geometry in a place that shouldn't have any. I took the headlamp from my pocket, habit when you love old things, and clicked it on. The beam glanced off a sealed can, then another, then another. Olive drab, ribbed sides, ammo cans, the long kind, the 40mm grenade size, the ones you can barely lift when they're full of anything heavy. I swallowed and told my pulse to be less obvious about itself. 5 cans visible, more below in a tidy stack. Under the first layer, a different shape, round and squat. Stainless drums, the kind used for solvents or for anything you don't want to admit to. A sweat broke across my back that the wind couldn't find. The headlamp picked up a corner where one ammo can's stenciled letters had survived. Cal. The rest, scraped away by time. Another can's lid wore a strip of duct tape, and on the tape, somebody had written in neat block letters with a marker that had faded to brown, G. I laughed then, a short sound that wasn't funny. The ground trembled beneath one knee. Not an earthquake, the heavy truck breath of a far-off engine. I held still until whatever it was passed. The desert is full of things larger than your fear. Air Force ranges, freight trains, thunderheads remembering how to walk. Okay, I told the sleeve, talking like you do to a skittish horse. Okay. Carefully, I hunted for the lift ring on the nearest ammo can. Decades of dust had set like a thin cement across everything. I coaxed a fingernail under the ring's edge, worked it free, and pulled. The can moved a little and then found a protest to lodge. I rocked it gently side to side. It rose by stubborn degrees, a patient tooth from a reluctant jaw. When it cleared the lip, the can surprised me with its weight. Heavy enough to slow me, not heavy enough to stop me. Heavy like knowledge. I swung it out onto the gravel and laid it soft. The hinge pins were seized, but the latch gave after a convincing argument. The seal coughed. Inside, black plastic mylar bags, heat-sealed shiny like beetle shell. Each bag held bricks the size of paperback novels, 9 bricks to a layer, 2 layers, a soft rattle when I shook it against my thigh. I slid my knife, good steel, kept sharp, a quarter-inch into the side seam. The blade felt like a trespass I'd have to answer for later. The mylar parted with a sound like someone biting into an apple. Inside, the bricks were wrapped again, this time in brown paper, banded by brittle currency straps. The band's faint printing still read $10,000. A tiny bank name under it I didn't recognize. The year printed beneath punched the air out of my lungs. 2009. I peeled the brown paper back from one brick, like turning back the page of a book you're not supposed to read yet. The smell of dry cotton, green, faces. $100 bill stared back at me with the calm indifference of someone who has been important for too long. I looked up so fast I almost saw stars. Wind thinned and thickened the sound of the world. Somewhere far off, a raven called and got no answer. My own breath sounded like someone else had borrowed it. I put the lid back on the can without sealing it, then crouched and peered down into the sleeve at the drums waiting underneath the visible cans. Stainless, welded, fastened with crimped rings. Somebody had planned for time to try and fail. "Who were you?" I asked the hole, as if the desert would hand me a name for the hand that had done this, for the plan that required this much patience and this much fear. I took photos. My hand shook, and in every picture, the light looked like a rumor. I put the can back, couldn't help it, and lowered the lid until I felt a kiss of suction close. Then I scrubbed the disturbed gravel with my glove, erased the edges of what I'd done, and replaced a couple of rocks that had taken a century to be so convincing. This was the part when a sensible person would drive to the sheriff's office and say words in the correct order. "I found something. On my property. I'd like to do this right." But the desert isn't kind to people who are only sensible. It demands a certain romance, a willingness to listen to your gut when it says, "Wait, there is a story here. Don't rush the ending." I took the long way around to the truck, eyes on the ridgeline, ears open for a change in the wind's argument. Twice I stopped to crouch in the shade of a boulder and let my pulse catch up. The world looked the same and tasted different. It felt obscene to be the only person breathing who knew what breathed under that cap.
At the gate, I saw fresh tire tracks in the dust beside my truck's own. The kind a wide off-road tire makes when some city boy remembers to air down. They cut in from the two-track that continued along the fence line and stopped 20 yards from my tailgate. At the end of the prints, a half moon where someone had set a boot and pivoted to look. My mouth went dry. I scanned the scrub. The heat made a mirage of everything beyond 50 feet, but the kind of glance that looks without moving eventually finds what it deserves. On the ridge opposite Toccoa, a flick of glass. Then another, binoculars. A man's silhouette stooped. Another shape beside him, shorter, broad-shouldered. I lifted my canteen like a woman too proud to wave. One of the silhouettes lifted an arm in a lazy half salute. Then both slid out of sight behind the ridge like they'd only been stretching their legs. I waited, counting my own heartbeats against the tick-tick of cooling metal under the hood. 10, 20, 40. Nothing moved, except a lizard doing push-ups on the hot tailgate, like a gym teacher from a gentler universe. When the world stayed the kind of quiet that isn't safe or dangerous yet, just listening, I fished a little black box out of the toolbox, the GPS tracker sweeper I'd bought after too many years doing drone surveys for people whose definition of consent was, "we told you to." I cowered under the chassis and ran the wand along the frame rails. On the rear crossmember, it sang. The device was the size of a soap bar and held by a magnet with an ego. I pried it away with the pry bar and dropped it into an empty thermos without letting it touch the truck bed. I screwed the lid on and put the thermos in the cab on the passenger floor. Whoever was watching would get to watch themselves drive in circles later. I should have left then.
I should have driven straight to the sheriff and handed over the tracker and my fear and let the system do what it does in its own time. But I had a hole in my land full of someone's plan and a day burning toward the kind of storm that makes floodplains remember their jobs. If the sky let loose, any sign of the sleeve could disappear under a new story water would write in one violent hour. And if those men on the ridge weren't part of the long-ago plan but the new one, I didn't want them to beat me back to my own secret. I drove the truck behind a low basalt knuckle, killed the engine, and covered the hood with a tarp the color of dust. Then I took only what I could explain: shovel, headlamp, a roll of surveyor's flagging tape, the metal detector for show, and the thermos with the tracker so my route would be a lie, and cut a path back along the shallow side of the ridge above the sleeve. Cloud shadow lapped the land. Thunder stitched itself behind the jagged horizon to the south. The wind shifted, and the smell of rain came on like a memory of a kinder place. My heart kept trying to climb into my mouth and look out. At the sleeve, I crouched and listened. The world offered the sound of an insect I couldn't place, and the far clatter of rock as a jackrabbit made a bad choice and corrected it. I brushed the gravel and found the cap again by feel. I lifted it just enough to break the seal and then eased it to the side. "Hello, trouble," I whispered. This time I went for one of the stainless drums. I wanted to know whether the ammo cans were the bulk of it or a garnish. The ring clamp was a puzzle, but one my hands knew by reputation. I wedged the screwdriver under the ring's ear, levered it up, turned the screw half a revolution. The ring sighed apart and loosened. A tug, and the lid lifted enough to get under it. The smell that came out was almost nothing, just a hint of machine oil and the stubborn absence of air. Inside, Mylar again, but heavier weight, weld-sealed. Each bag inside the drum was labeled with an embossed tag, A1, A2, A3. Like a person who loved order had numbered their worries. I lifted one bag and had to adjust my stance. Heavy, too heavy for paper. I danced the edge of my knife through a corner in pride. Gold doesn't glow the way people on TV want it to. It sulks. It's so dense that the light can't figure out what to do with it, so it just sits there and lets your bones do the math. The bar was the size of a hardback and stamped with numbers that meant nothing but felt like a sentence. AU 400 ounces. The refinery's mark had been ground, then buffed, then stamped again with something that wasn't quite letters. The wind chose that moment to bring me other people. Voices, faint at first, then clearer, riding the gust down the wash. The easy cadence of men who believe the world is already theirs. A laugh that didn't need a punchline. The kind of boots that hit the ground like punctuation. I eased the lid back on the drum, spun the ring shut, and lowered the sleeve cap without letting it clang, hands suddenly remembering how to be other things: bird, shadow, rumor. I brushed the gravel smooth with my forearm until my skin rasped. Then I slid backwards on my belly into the thin shade of a creosote, tasted dust, and wished I'd brought a different life. ATV engines coughed into earshot, a pair, then a third catching up. They idled down on the far side of the ridge, a cough and then quiet, and after that, only boot scrape and breath. The first voice again, closer now. "Tracks peel off here, she's not dumb." Another voice, "Dawson says she's stubborn, not dumb. Difference matters." Dawson. Heat flooded my face in that special way of anger has of looking like shame. Gravel shifted 10 yards upslope, and a man came into view. A hat, a jawline, a pair of binoculars that thought very well of themselves. He scanned the flats, the ridge, the gate, the broken-back cattle fence, not out of love, but out of inventory. Another man squatted by the cairn and poked at the iron pin with a twig, like he wanted it to confess. "Juniper Voss, you out here playing pirate?" He waited, like a fisherman waits,
giving line and then taking it back. When the silence held, he smiled with his voice. We should talk about that parcel swap. West 40 for your East 40. Water rights attached. I'm practically a philanthropist. Another voice, bored and expensive. We're losing light. The binoculars lowered. We've got time. They split up, one man following the fence line, one man angling up slope toward the seam. The other stayed near the cairn and studied the ground like it owed him something. The wind flicked the brim of my hat against the rock behind me, and I wanted to murder it with my mind. A single drop of rain hit my wrist and felt like an accusation. I closed my eyes and pictured the sleeve, the cans, the drums, the tidy stack under the earth, the bands labeled $10,000, the 2009, the bar that soaked in my palm like gravity given a face. I pictured the tracker in the thermos and the way Dawson's name sounded carried by men who considered themselves inevitable. When I opened my eyes, the binoculars were turned almost, but not exactly toward me. Just enough that if he'd been sloppy with his boredom, he might have slid right past me and given me back my breath. He wasn't sloppy. He lifted a hand and pointed, not at me, but at the seam shoulder. There, he said softly, that area's been touched. The man nearest the seam knelt. His hand hovered over the gravel, then made a slow, satisfied fist. He didn't look up when he spoke. She found something. We're going to let her finish finding it, and then we'll help. Thunder rolled. Not a crack, not a clap, but the long carriage of a god clearing its throat. I slid my hand along the rock until my fingers found the headlamp, the knife, the coil of survey tape. I thought of my grandfather's maps. I thought of the clerk's penciled eyebrows lifting at the corner of kindness. I thought of the hawk tracing its circles like it knew what was coming and wanted the first right to witness it. I thought of $50 million sleeping under 6 inches of gravel and a century of dust, and the men who came to wake it up and rename it. I watched the first curtain of rain drag itself across the far valley like a theater cue, and I knew that whatever happened next would change the shape of my life, whether the desert chewed me up or I learned the trick of its teeth. Okay, I whispered to the land and to myself. A private treaty signed without witnesses. Here we go.
Rain stitched the distance into curtains while those men stitched my name into their mouths. I could taste copper from biting my tongue, could feel the creosote's resin on my cheek where I pressed my face to the earth. The first drops were fat enough to leave perfect circles in the dust before they vanished, like coins tossed into a fountain that didn't believe in wishes. The man with the binoculars, wide-brim hat, clean boots that hadn't earned their scuffs yet, stood with his heels braced on the slope as if the ridge were a stage and I were somewhere in the front row. "We'll let her finish finding it," he said, almost kindly. My name, in his voice, felt like a palm on the back of my neck. Thunder rolled again. I counted without meaning to. 3, 4, 5. Sound behind light by a mile and change. The wash below us answered with a dry rattle like bones in a jar. I slid my hand out slow and let the surveyor's tape unspool between my fingers. Neon orange looks ridiculous in a place that does color with minerals instead of dyes, but that was the point. I tied a flag loose to a rabbit brush branch and gave it just enough slack to flicker when the wind changed. 10 feet upslope, I pressed the heel of my hand into damp dust and then dragged it sideways to mimic the kind of scuff a careless boot makes. 20 feet beyond that, I used the shovel's tip to nick a straight groove the length a metal detector coil might leave if you were looking and sloppy. A path of dumb hope leading away from the truth. Lightning stitched the flat horizon. The smell of petrichor came up from the ground like someone had cracked the earth's knuckles. The men fanned out. Binoculars took the high line. The bored, expensive voice stayed near the cairn and watched the fence.
The third man, broad-shouldered, quiet, drifted toward my false trail like a needle answering magnetic north. My heartbeat quit trying to break out and started to work for me. I slid backward, belly to rock, then slipped sideways like a lizard between stones until the seam was at my shoulder and the sleeve just below my boots. By the time a raindrop found the corner of my mouth, I'd brushed the cap free with the practiced urgency of a thief who believes in keeping his oaths. I eased it aside, felt the suction kiss my knuckles, and breathed the old air again, the preserved absence that had become ours. "Be quick," I told myself with my grandfather's voice. The stainless drum's ring lever bit my palm before it gave. I spun it open, lifted the lid a hand's width, and reached for the heavy mylar bag labeled A1. The wind shoved raindrops into my ear and little cold bullets. I got my arms around the bag and brought it up like a sleeping child, awkward, heavier than you'd guess looking down, and set it on the gravel past the lip. For a second the world reduced itself to the sound of metal on rock and the far grumble of water starting to find itself. A shout lifted from the ridge to my right. "Fresh scuffs!" Not toward me, toward my decoy flags. I nearly laughed from the relief so sharp it hurt. The wind tattered another curtain of rain across the valley and hid me for 3 heartbeats. I used them to slide the drum's lid back in place, spin the ring tight, and settle the cap flush. No clang, just the soft refusal of things fitting as designed. I brushed with my forearm until my skin felt flayed, then rolled the A1 bag into the shadow of a basalt wafer and slid my day pack over it like a casual afterthought. Boots crushed gravel above me. The broad-shouldered man crouched by my fake coil mark, ran a finger along the groove and lifted a pinch of wet grit to his nose like the earth had a scent a liar couldn't fake. I didn't breathe. Rain ran from the brim of his hat and little cold bullets. He said, "She's here. Close." The binoculars man's reply floated down, amused and patient. "Close isn't good enough, Cole. Cole. A name to hang my fear on." Lightning tore the sky exactly over the far ridge, white so bright that the world went briefly negative. 1,000. 1,000. Thunder collapsed on us at 3. The wash spoke up, no longer a rattle but a throat clearing. I could feel the basalt cool under my belly as the heat bled out of the day. I slid the A1 bag into the day pack and cinched it until the straps complained. 100 pounds? A little less? Enough to change how my body would move. Enough to change a life. A pebble pinged as it took a new path by my elbow. Tiny, obvious as a dropped coin in a library. Cole's head turned. His eyes, ice gray, or maybe just storm gray, dragged along the rocks, the creosote, the seam, and landed 2 feet left of my boots. Not on me, on the creosote. The plant's top needles had been wiped clean by the brush of my sleeve. He followed that tiny geometry and then finally me. Our eyes met the way 2 knives accidentally touch in a drawer. We didn't move for 1 beat. Then he did, hand down, gun up. Not a flourish, but the inevitable answer to a math problem he'd solved twice already. I let gravity be my accomplice. I rolled, clutching the day pack to my chest, and slid down the shale face on my shoulder blades and heels. The first shot hit above me with a heavy smack that threw chips of rock into my hair. The second shot was late. I'd already kicked off into the shallow run of the wash, a narrow trough that had been dry 5 hours ago, and now wore an inch of water rushing faster than your body wants it to. The cold bit my shins like a dog. The day pack pulled at my spine. I ran, then slipped, then half floated as the water thickened around my calves and started to think about my knees. Shouts behind me, "Left! She's in the cut!" And a hiss, "Don't shoot the drum for God's sake." Good information, that. The wash pinched toward a choke where the ridge had shed boulders and some older storm. The first wave of the flood arrived not as a wall, but as a negotiation, A tide line of brown foam came furred with twigs and ant legs. The water thickened around my thighs and tried to fold my knees. I grabbed a rock and let it skin my palm. The sky had settled into that half-light that makes people stupid. I made myself into something the water would let pass rather than argue with it head-on. My grandfather used to tell me the difference between stubborn and steady is whether you're listening while you dig in.
Another shot. The sound cracked flat in the rain and then tumbled around the rocks like a coin down a chute. A chunk of basalt to my right coughed dust and then collapsed into the wash in a slow, inevitable shrug. The water took it and used it as a lesson on weight. I waded to the left bank where the cut undercut itself into a shallow shelf and hugged the wall, my boots finding purchase in places that weren't there yet. Ahead, the choke of boulders rose into a low pour-over where the wash narrowed to less than a truck's width. If I could get past that, the channel braided into 3 lazy arcs and the world would widen. If I couldn't, I'd be a story people told about the first storm of the season. A movement to my right, the bored voice man, came trotting along the ridgeline parallel to me, gun hand down like he didn't expect to need it yet. Rain slicked his hair to his skull where his hat had blown back and hung by its stampede string. He looked offended by the weather. "Come on out, sweetheart," he called, cheerful as a radio ad. "You're not gonna like how this ends if we do it my way." "Same," I said under my breath, and dove forward through the pour-over, using my forearms like blades. The daypack tried to lever me backward as the water lifted it. For an awful second, I became a hinge with no pin, both ends moving in opposite directions. I got my knees under me, drove forward with my thighs, and was suddenly through, spat into the wider reach of the wash where the flood spread itself thinner. Behind me, Cole reached the pour-over and hesitated. He didn't want to be in the water. He wanted to be on the rock, looking down at the world he understood. But the world had other plans. The rain hit its stride. The surface of the flood went from freckled to scaly to the kind of smooth that means it stopped negotiating. I banged into a shin-high boulder, bit my tongue again, tasted blood again, and grabbed the boulder's head like it owed me an apology. The wash bent left, then right, then left toward a low, old culvert. Concrete, stained the color of tobacco, built back when the county thought culverts fixed everything. I crab ran toward it, shoved the daypack in first, then jammed my shoulders after it, skinning both elbows and finally recognizing they'd already been bleeding from the shale slide. The culvert was a cool mouth 2 body widths across that led 20 feet under the old road and out into a stand of alkali Sacaton that knew more about surviving than any of us. I hauled myself into the culvert, turned on my side to leave room for breath, and listened. Boots on rock. A man restrained his breath and failed. Another voice, binoculars man, closer than I wanted him to be. "She's smart. Leave it. The sleeve stays put in this much water. We work the edges, we wait the hour, and we go in when it's quiet." Cole swore softly, a word that had less to do with anger than with respect he wished he didn't have. "She took something." "We took a tracker," Binoculars said, and I pictured my thermos on the cab floor where I'd left it, the device inside quietly pretending to watch me while I planned to betray it. "We'll know what she cares about most by where she runs." The bored-voiced man snorted. "Home," he said. "They always run home." Lightning peeled the sky open again. The culvert amplified the thunder until it rattled my teeth. I kissed the daypack with my forehead like it was a person and felt the stupid sting of tears the rain didn't earn. When the flood stopped sounding like argument and started sounding like agreement, when the stones settled back into the conversation and the water's hiss softened into breath, I wormed out the far side of the culvert into grass that leaned in one direction like a crowd after a shot. I kept my body low and went perpendicular to my land, not toward my truck. The men were right about a lot of things. I wouldn't let them be right about that. A horned lizard crossed my path, bright as a dropped bead. I took it as a benediction and kept going. By the time I reached the basalt knuckle where I had hit in the truck, the rain had downgraded itself to commentary.
The tarp wore a skin of wet dust and one neat footprint I hadn't put there. I held still long enough to hear my own heart say my name, then eased the tarp back in inches. The truck sat where I had left it, but the driver's door lock wore the telltale bright scratch of a pick that had slipped. My toolbox was untouched. The cab was too neat. He'd been inside. Or they had. The thermos still sat on the passenger floor, lid screwed on. I unscrewed it a quarter turn and listened for the rattle of the tracker's innards. Satisfied, I tightened it again and wedged it under the seat so it would hear a different story soon. I slid the day pack behind the seat, dropped one of my oldest surveys on top of it, then pulled a rolled topo mat from the toolbox, the kind printed on that waterproof paper that makes you feel competent. I spread it across the hood under the tarp and laid a pencil along the line of my land, like I was planning a fence repair. If the binoculars man had a scope on me, he'd get what he wanted, the silhouette of a woman doing small ranch math at dusk. Then I did something I didn't want to do. I called Dawson Pike. He answered on the first ring like he'd been waiting, voice bright with a salesman's ability to sound like your friend in your future. "Miss Voss, I told your friends I was stubborn. I was generous." A beat of silence. A chair creaked under him. "Always room to upgrade an assessment." I said, "It's raining." Non-committal as a weather report. "The washers are going to cut new mouths tonight." "They do that," he agreed. "You came onto my property. County 2 tracks are public easements for fence inspections, and you do have a hell of a fence problem. East line looks like it's got a gate somebody forgot to fix. I'll send you a bill for the hinge."
He laughed. Not the fake grin laugh from the courthouse, something older, less rehearsed. "I like you, Juniper. You're not like the others." "I'm a person," I said, "not a category." "Sure," he said, unbothered. "You want to trade? West 40 for East 40? Water rights intact. This storm's a reminder of what you could have." "Not thirsty," I said, and watched the far ridge for the flick of glass. Nothing. They were patient. Or they were closer than I liked. "Everyone's thirsty eventually. I'm sending you a service announcement," I said, keeping my voice level. "If you set a boot on my land again without my say-so, I'll call the sheriff and BLM and I'll make it loud enough a judge in Prescott hears it over breakfast." "You think the sheriff knows what you think the sheriff knows?" he asked, amusement back in his tone. "Half this county's bored unless somebody's cattle get out. The other half's tired. Neither half wants a desert soap opera." "I don't need them to want it," I said. "I just need them to file it." Another little silence. When he spoke again, the radio host veneer was back. "Offer stands through noon tomorrow. After that, market forces take over." "Let them," I said, and hung up before he could enjoy his own echo. I sat with the tarp still over me, listening to rain tick its nails along the canvas, and let my breath slow until it sounded like it belonged to me again. I needed time and witnesses. I needed proof and people who weren't for sale. I needed to not carry 100 pounds of confession around in a day pack like a neon sign I'd taped to my spine. In my head, I made a short list of people whose names didn't taste like compromises. The clerk at the recorder's office who had asked me if I understood boundaries. A hydrologist I knew from drone work who had once watched me climb into a survey pit and had said, "Damn, Voss," with honest admiration. And Hester at the pawn shop, a woman who taught me to respect everything with a hinge. I put the truck in gear and kept the tarp tented over the hood until I was rolling, then let the wind yank it off in one dramatic scold I was certain was visible from the ridge. I drove not toward town, but toward the long way to town, south first, then west, making sure if the tracker inside the thermos told stories, it would tell one with detours and alibis. The asphalt hissed under my tires like a secret I promised to keep. The storm trailed the truck like a dog finally off leash. By the time I hit the edge of town, the rain had thinned to polite. Neon in the motel signs sputtered itself brave. I didn't go home.
Hester's pawnshop wore its bars like jewelry, wrought iron shaped into desert flowers by a welder with a mother. The bell over the door had the old tone real brass makes when it remembers churches. Hester looked up from the stool where she was cleaning a revolver I was certain had a story. She took in my hat, the mud, the bleeding elbows, the way I kept my shoulders from sagging by force, and she didn't say, "What happened?" She said, "Come on back." I followed her through a curtain of chain links into the back room where she kept the good coffee and the better advice. The air smelled like cosmoline and boiled water, comfort built from other people's carefulness. I set the day pack on the scarred table between us, and the table made a sound that admitted weight without judgment. Hester watched my hands. She could read a person by their knuckles. She said, "You pulled something heavy out of somewhere you shouldn't have been, or out of somewhere you should have been and other people think you shouldn't." "Second one," I said. "I need a safe. Not the kind with chrome, the kind that makes a burglar sigh because they understand they're about to have a bad day." She cocked her head. "Tempted to tell you to call the sheriff first." "I will. After I quit bleeding and quit being angry enough to say the wrong thing to the wrong deputy on the wrong day." Her eyes flicked to my elbows and back to my face. She set a clean towel and a bottle of hydrogen peroxide on the table, like she was setting down an argument she knew she'd win. "You do those," she said, nodding at my arms. "I'll do this." She slid a steel key across the table like a card in a game. "Back room. Stack against the cellar wall. Brown door looks like it leads to brooms. It doesn't. 10 minutes." I cleaned my scrapes and hissed, and felt the small, ordinary relief of taking care of a problem I could measure. Then I took the key and carried the day pack into the back where the concrete walls held summer at bay. The brown door opened into a narrow set of steps where my boots sounded like punctuation. At the bottom, the Sate Hester had meant sat with its back to the earth. Thick steel, no gloss, a wheel dial older than me and better educated. I spun the dial with the little flourish you pick up when you've watched someone do it 1,000 times, opened the door, and traded the bag's contents for the safe's indifference. The Mylar bag labeled A1 went in first. I hesitated over the second thing I'd taken without mentioning to myself I'd taken it. One brick of cash I'd slipped from the ammo can and wrapped in a spare bandana like a lunch. I put that in too. The safe took both like a priest who'd heard worst. When I came back up, Hester was filling 2 mugs. She slid one to me and watched me taste it like she'd baked me a cake and wanted me to be honest. She asked after a sip, "Are you going to tell me?" "Eventually, or immediately if you tell me I'm making a mistake." "You're making a mistake," she said, calmly. I laughed, a cracked little thing that made me sound both braver and more tired than I was. "You don't know what it is yet." "I know you. I know that look." I told her everything but the number, the sleeve, the ammo cans, the drums, the bar that sulked, the tracker under my truck, Dawson's voice that could make people sign away their patience, the men on the ridge, the storm that had done me the favor of being inconvenient. Hester didn't blink at the parts a person less sure would have called unbelievable. When she finished, she said, "So, you found a crime that's been aging like whiskey, and you put your mouth on it. Yeah, that's about it. You can keep your mouth, or you can keep the whiskey. Hard to keep both. I need a lawyer. One who uses words like filings and injunction and doesn't like the taste of Dawson Pike's handshakes. You need 2, not unkind. Criminal and civil. And you need a phone you didn't buy with your name." She got up, reached under the counter, and produced a cheap flip phone still in its plastic, like a promise nobody was in a hurry to redeem. "For right now," she said. "Text only. Numbers I put in there. Burner of the burners." "Why do you have that?" "Because I listen to my customers, and because sometimes a person needs to buy a guitar and not have their ex-husband see it on the credit card." The bell out front made its brass mind up and clanged. Hester's eyes cut to the doorway. She tilted at me and mouthed, "Stay." Then she went out. Voices, blared by the rings in the door like water on a bell. "Looking for a friend," he said. I didn't have to see his hat to know it was the bored one. Tall, hat like trouble, elbows like she took a fall. "Can't help you," Hester said pleasantly. "I sell things. I don't keep people." "Shame," the man said. "She's got something that belongs to someone else." "Most of us do. Ask around." A smaller sound carried, metal hitting glass very softly, like a coin set down on a counter with manners. "What is it you sell, exactly?" the man asked, interest counterfeit and still spendable. "Exit strategies and occasional harmonicas."
He laughed, but it hit at a wrong angle, like a hinge that needed oil. Footsteps moved around the displays. He stopped near the case where Hester kept the vintage knives, the ones with bone that had belonged to a living thing before it belonged to a man who thought he was owed it. "Nice place," he said. "Shame if somebody bought everything and then left a bad review." "You do what you need to feel big," Hester said. "Still pleasant. But take it from somebody who's been your age longer than you have. If you leave me a mess, I won't clean it up. I'll preserve it. I'll take pictures, I'll write dates and names and make copies. I'll give those copies to people who are bored and to people who are tired. And I'll still be here when you're picking up litter on the side of the highway in an orange vest that doesn't flatter you." A little beat. Then the bored-voiced man chuckled like he'd been clapped out of a joke he didn't get. "Have a nice day, ma'am." The bell gave its verdict again. The door shut, the room sucked its air back. Hester waited a full 30 seconds, looking at the wall clock like it had answers, then came back. "They'll be waiting in the parking lot at the grocery store or at the turn to your road," she said. "They are professionals in the sense that they do this for money. They are amateurs in the sense that they don't take women seriously until the bill comes due." "I can go out the alley," I said. "You can go out the roof," she said. "But first, call your lawyer. Use that phone. Don't say gold. Don't say drums. Say, 'I found a thing on my property that I believe is evidence of a previous felony.' Let them ask the nouns." I nodded, flipped open the little phone, and dialed the number Hester had saved under Law Tony. Tony answered with the exhausted confidence of someone who'd learned to keep their own voice from making promises their job couldn't. I gave her the version Hester had told me to give, plus just enough adjectives to make her hurry. She said the words I wanted. "Don't talk to anyone else. Text me coordinates. Sit tight. I'm on my way." "Don't use your car," I said before I could stop myself. "They have eyes." "I have more than one," she said. "You're not the only paranoid client in Mojave County." I hung up and exhaled a breath that tried to come out in pieces. Hester set a hand on the table near mine. Not on me, near me. "We do this slow. We do this loud enough that if somebody wants to rewrite it later, they've got to erase ink, not pencil." The store phone rang. Hester glanced at the caller ID and grimaced. "Recorder's office," she said. "That'll be Dottie. You made an impression." She lifted the receiver and listened, eyebrows drawing together like she was watching a child do something dangerous but necessary. "Uh-huh. She's here? Alive? Bleeding, apparently?" "Yeah, I'll tell her." She covered the mouthpiece and looked at me. "2 men came by asking if you'd filed anything else today. Said they were from the title company. Dottie is not new. She asked for cards. They didn't have cards. She asked for names. They had names, but she said their mouths didn't fit them. Tell her thank you. Just tell her thank you." Hester relayed the gratitude and hung up. "You sleep here," she said, like I'd argued. "You use the cot in the back. I'm going to put the closed sign on early and pretend I'm doing inventory. Your truck can take care of itself." My truck has a tracker and a thermos. I was going to throw it in the bed of the first vehicle that looked like it had somewhere else to be. Hester's smile was small and satisfied. "I figured. I sent my nephew to the feed store.
He's going to take the scenic route out to Bullhead with a thermos in his passenger footwell and a stubborn streak you'll admire. How did you... You're not the only stubborn person in this county, she said, amused. Sit, drink, practice not dying. We ate soup from a dented pot. The storm ran out of ambition and rattled itself into silence. The pawnshop settled the way a house does after a long day, glass case ticking as it cooled, the compressor in the Coke machine cycling like a lazy heartbeat. I texted Tony the coordinates of the sleeve and the rim of the culvert and the cairn with the 1911 pin. She replied with a thumbs up and a word that I liked her. Paperwork. Around 9, Hester showed me the cot. She handed me a fresh T-shirt from a stack of unclaimed pawns, a band I'd never heard of, size I wouldn't have chosen. It felt like armor anyway. You good? She asked. No, I said, but I'm pointed at it. Good, she said, and turned off the light. I woke to the sound of glass being careful. It wasn't to shatter. It was the almost sound a razor makes when it decides between cutting and not. My body did the math faster than my head. I was on my feet with the day pack off the hook, heart loud enough I wanted to tell it to whisper. In the front of the shop, something breathed that wasn't mechanical. Hester stepped out of the office on cat feet, a stubby flashlight in one hand, the revolver from earlier in the other. She didn't look at me. She kept her eyes on the seam of light under the front door. She mouthed, 3. I nodded. Through the bars on the front windows, I saw a shape pass, and then another, then a third, like shadows that were proud of themselves. A quiet voice came through the door, right at the lock. Ma'am, Sheriff's Office. We had a report of a break-in on this block. Everything okay in there? Hester raised an eyebrow I wanted to frame. She slid the revolver into my hand like she was passing a baton and went to the small monitor that showed the stoop. The camera's angle caught the brim of a hat, the square of a chest, the sheen of a badge that could have been won or bought. The man leaned toward the glass so his face filled the monitor. He had the kind of smile people practice with a mirror and the kind of eyes that don't bother. Deputy, Hester called, sweet as a pie she hadn't baked. Show me your ID up against the glass, left side, right side, then spin around and let me see the two in the car with you. The man's smile thinned. Ma'am, time is of the essence in a call like this. Time is of the essence when it's real. If it's theater, we got all night. A pause. Then a temper showed its ankle and pretended it hadn't. The man lifted an ID up to the glass. It looked like a perfectly fine ID. It would look perfectly fine to a person who wanted it to be. He spun around, pointed at the patrol car. The camera caught a standard decal, a standard light bar, a standard number of dents in the bumper. The two in the car looked like the kind of men who know the cuffs don't have to be tight if the story is going to get written their way anyway. Hester nodded at me. She flicked the deadbolt, then the second, then the chain, slow as a blessing, and opened the door 3 inches, not for the men, for the law. The man stepped toward the gap the way a person leans toward a handshake they think they own. Hester put the toe of her boot out and touched the edge of his shoe. Name? She asked. Deputy Klein. You have a Juniper Voss in there? He said my name like a coin swallowed wrong. No, Hester said promptly, the way a grandmother lies to a wolf. I have alarms and cameras and a teenage nephew in the back with a baseball bat and poor impulse control. The man's smile came back and tried again. We'd like to step in and make sure you're safe.
I'm safer with the door shut, Hester said, and did exactly that. She threw the locks. Then she flicked a switch that made every light in the store come on at once, like noon. The 3 men outside flinched as if their own proof had turned on them. Hester reached under the counter and hit another switch. Red strobes wept above the door like a cheap casino. Somewhere a siren I didn't expect wailed like it missed its mama. "That one's not for show," Hester said lightly. "Central Dispatch gets a nice photo package when I hit it, with timestamps. Should be any minute now." Client's face did a thing a face does when it realizes the presentation has gone off script. He leaned close enough to fog the glass. "Miss Voss," he said softly, knowing I could hear even if he wanted to pretend he didn't, "you don't know what you're in the middle of." "Yes, I do," I said, and was surprised at how calm it sounded. "And so do you." His eyes flattened. He straightened. The three men walked back to the car the way men walk when they can't decide whether to punt or to set the ball on fire. They chose neither. They got in, the car rolled forward quiet as a cat, and then faster than a person with an actual call would drive. The siren in the shop kept weeping, like it was being paid by the tier. Hester turned it off. The sudden quiet made my skin ring. She put a hand on my shoulder this time, solid. "Tony?" she asked. "On her way," I said. "Paperwork." Hester grinned, wolf to wolf finally. "Good." We waited. 15 minutes later, a car door out back shut with the sound only a person trying to be respectful makes. A quick, crisp knock on the alley door. Hester looked through the fisheye and relaxed parts of her I hadn't known were tensed. She opened up. Tony stepped in like a person who carries the weather with her. Short, late 40s, rain jacket that had seen better storms, and eyes that had seen worse men. "Juniper," she said, and we shook hands like we both meant it. "Don't tell me anything yet. Give me the 3 nouns you think will get me a judge out of bed." "Buried drums, cash bricks, gold." She nodded. "That'll do." She set a folder on the table and started laying out forms like a blackjack dealer who knew the house odds and the loopholes. "We file a property preservation notice. We get BLM to care by making them afraid they won't be involved when the story gets told. We call the sheriff's on-call and make sure the deputy who shows up has a body cam and a supervisor who isn't named Klein." "You know Klein," I said. She snorted. "I know his ex-wife. She's the one who told me Klein is a noun." Hester laughed out loud, delighted and bitter both. I breathed for what felt like the first time since the sleeve. Tony looked at me over the top of the papers. "One more thing. Do you have any physical sample on you?" "In the safe. 1 bar, 1 cash brick." "Good," she said. "We will not be the only people with samples when the sun comes up, but we will be the only people with chain of custody that won't embarrass us." She pulled out a small pelican case like a magician pulling out a dove, opened it and showed me swabs, tamper-evident bags, a scale, and a tiny UV flashlight. "We do this like television, but boring." We were halfway through photographing the bar in Hester's back room, the stamp, the ground-off mark, the weight on Tony's scale, when the flip phone buzzed against the table and made all 3 of us flinch. Unknown number. I looked at Hester. She nodded. I opened the phone and read the text. A live picture. My land, in the ramped-up color night vision gives when it's trying too hard to be day. The sleeves cap off, a gloved hand holding a crowbar just inside the frame like a stage direction. Underneath, a line of text that made the room tilt. "Move the cap back, or we start digging with backhoes." Another image came in before I could breathe. A second angle. Headlights pointing at the basalt holder where my tracks had been, now washed soft by rain. A third image. My truck parked behind the knuckle, tarp gone, hood still dusty wet. The caption this time was just my name. "Juniper?" Tony said, already moving to kill the lights so we weren't giving anyone a show through the windows. I swallowed a mouthful of air. "They're at the sleeve," I said. "Right now." Hester locked the alley door, shot the top bolt, then the bottom one, then a bolt I hadn't seen before because it was inside the door jamb like a trick. Tony snapped the pelican case shut and stood so still I finally understood what certain animals mean by stillness. "We wanted witnesses," she said evenly. "We're about to get them." The flip phone buzzed again. One more picture, tight and ugly and perfect. A shovel's blade.
polished by water and use, poised over the dark mouth of the sleeve. The shovel had a sticker on the handle, a blue swallow mid-dive, twin to the neon sign in town that had flickered at me like a dare when I left the recorder's office. The caption was 4 words I felt in my teeth. "We know where you sleep." Lightning, somewhere far away now, a long patient roll of thunder that only arrived after I had already started to move. I grabbed the bar off the table. Tony was already dialing 2 numbers at once. Hester was already throwing me my hat. We 3 looked at each other with the shared recognition that we were either about to stop a story or get written by it. I shoved the bar into my pack and said something I'd never said to anyone in my life, not even to myself. "I'm not running." Hester nodded once, eyes bright and fierce. "Good," she said. "Then neither are we." We were 2 steps from the alley door when the store phone rang again. Not the direct line, the old rotary one Hester kept for stubbornness and sentiment. Its bell sounded like a train crossing signal softened by time. Hester froze. We all did. She lifted the receiver, like the past weighs less. A familiar voice slid into the room through 30 feet of copper wire. "Juniper?" Dawson Pike said pleasantly. "Look up." The ceiling above the back room whumped as if someone had dropped a sandbag. Dust sifted from the rafters in a slow, astonished veil. A small camera on a black gimbal crept into view through the open duct like a mechanical spider and pointed its eye at us. "Smile. You're on the evening news." The camera's red LED blinked once, twice, and then began to stream. I didn't breathe. I didn't blink. I took 1 step forward and raised the revolver. Outside, somewhere near enough to taste, a diesel engine downshifted, then idled like a big cat making up its mind. And then the feed on the flip phone changed to video. My sleeve, my land, the shovel, the cap, a gloved hand. The shovel started down. I squeezed the trigger.
"Let's take our breaths," the deputy said. He turned to me. "Miss Voss, you're going to walk me through what happened between town and here. Use small words. Pretend I'm your uncle who only shows up for funerals." I did. The grid, the cairn, the old pin stamped 1911 like a quiet oath, the pipe sleeve, the cap that was a secret with 6 bolts and 100 years of patience, the ammo cans, the mylar, the bands that said $10,000 and the year that punched the air out of my lungs. I said currency, and I said metal bars, and I didn't say gold because the word had too many teeth for the moment. "Why didn't you call us then?" he asked, as gently as a cop can ask a question he might need to apologize for later. "Because a man put a tracker on my truck," I said, "and because men were already looking through glass at my land like it owed them an apology." I nodded toward Dawson. "Because he offered to trade me water for my East 40 and then sent his men to inventory my decisions." "Allegedly," Tony murmured. "Loudly allegedly," I amended. "I called my lawyer. We called you." Dawson smiled past all of us at the body cams, as if to say, "People will edit this later, and I'm counting on their boredom." Ranger Ibarra knelt at the sleeve's edge and peered down, careful not to silhouette herself against the light for anyone's scope. "We do this by the book," she said. "A book with pictures. I want silt samples off the rim. I want a boot sole cast right there." She pointed at the place where the bored man's heel had bitten impatient Half Moon into damp grit. "I want that drone on the ground, or it gets an evidence tag when it falls." Dawson lifted both palms and nodded toward his pilot, some kid behind the backhoe with a tablet and the look of a man who'd mistaken a job for a personality. The drone dropped obediently and settled on the washbank like a locust that had remembered its manners. "Chain of custody starts now," Tony said, her voice low and fierce. And the deputy with the kind eyes gave her a respect meant for firefighters and teachers. They made us all step back until the scene was a stage with tape marks. The CSI techs went to work with brushes and swabs and small plastic bags that would add up to a story. They lifted the cap 2 inches, photo-documented the rust's pattern like it had its own opinion, and then raised it fully. Cameras leaned in like officials, and the inside of the sleeve became a public square. The first ammo can came out with ceremony. The latch fought after a decade and then gave like it knew the part of all this was to reveal. Inside, black mylar, brittle currency straps, bands that read $10,000 in the bank name no one recognized out loud. The deputy read the date and said it so the cams could have it. 2009. He did not whistle. I loved him more for that. The second can yielded a different culture. The same mylar, but inside each bag, wrapped separately, passports. Dozens. Different countries, some faces that looked like driver's license shots, some that looked like men dared to smile. A stack of slim, dark devices sealed like chocolate bars, old phones a generation or 3 back. A pelican case within the can, foam cut to cradle a ledger that had been rubbed soft by a careful hand. Ranger Ibarra set the case on a tarp and flipped it for the body cams. The ledger's first page was clean block letters in indelible ink. A date, a list of initials, amounts. The second page had a stamp in the corner, a swallow mid-dive, blue faded to bruise. The motel sign from town had gotten a cousin. Dawson's mouth did a tight, private thing. "This yours?" the deputy asked mildly. Dawson smiled the way a man smiles when this has worked before. "Looks like a bird." Cole was still and watchful, eyes on the ledger not like a thief eyeing the till, but like a boy in a library whose father had told him books bite. The third container, one of the stainless drums, took 4 of them to tilt and berth its top layer into the light. The mylar bag Tony had labeled for me in the pawn shop had a twin and then 10 more. The embossed tags A2, A3 ran through A10. Numbers, not names. The tech slid a corner of one bag with a scalpel and let the light sulk off density. Bars, stamped, and then dishonored with a grinder, and then stamped again with something that wanted to be letters and didn't make it. "Stop," Ranger Ibarra said, the word a hand. "Close that back up. We've seen what we needed to." The tech resealed the slit with evidence tape and a grief I recognized. We all have moments where you want both for a thing to be real and for it to never have been. The deputy looked at me. "Miss Voss, you understand that if any of this is tied to a specific crime, some of it's not going to be yours to keep. I understand that if it's tied to a specific wrong, it's not mine, even if the law says it is. But the law says what happens next, and not Dawson's men." "Allegedly," Tony breathed, and I didn't mind her enjoying herself. A radio crackled from the perimeter, nervous. "Unit 2, I got movement up on the ridge, east side." We all turned our heads in the same human way, a flock that had forgotten how to fly together. On the skyline, 3 figures broke themselves into fragments against a black sky. Silhouettes, gear, the clumsy grace of men trying to be less present than they were. One figure carried something wrong for the moment. Long, too long to be a shovel. "Down," the deputy snapped, and each of us turned into the smallest version of ourselves. The first shot cracked the air in the particular way modern rifles do. Flat, fast, eager. Rock spit back at the ring of light as the round hit exactly where the tech's pelvis had been a heartbeat before. The sound of the wash folded itself into something angrier.
"Hold your fire," Ranger Ibarra yelled at her deputies. "They're silhouetted. Don't give them muzzle flashes to aim at. Back the scene." The deputy nearest the backhoe lunged and killed the CSI floodlights with a slap. Darkness fell with the kind of intimacy only a desert can do. For 3 seconds the world was nothing but breath and the lavender shape of rain far off. Then the sheriff's SUVs went to red-blue, and the wash became a haunted river, the kind that tells you stories and then eats them. "Juniper," Tony hissed, close enough to borrow my shoulder.
We're pulling back to the culvert. We let them make the mistake while the cameras watch them make it. They've got the high line, I said. If they push down slope, they own the angle. Then we don't give them slope, she said. Another shot, lower. Not a warning. A man grunted. Dawson's bored lieutenant surprised to have a bruise where he had expected immunity. Cole swore softly. I felt him choose something in the dark, a small private decision cracking open years of bigger, worse ones. "I'm done," he said, voice low, and I had no idea if he meant with the job, or with the night, or with the person he'd been to get to this ridge. He reached down and palmed the sleeves cap, set it gently back in place without seating it, the way you lay a hand on a sleeping animal to tell it you're leaving and you'll be careful with the door. "Cole," Dawson hissed, a tiny stage whisper that just discovered it had an audience. Cole didn't answer him. He stepped toward me in the red-blue ghostlight and did something that startled me so badly I almost forgot to be afraid. He took my elbow like a gentleman. "There's a cut 3 yards back," he said. "Use it." "Why?" I asked before I could stop myself. "Because I don't like the math," he said simply, and turned his shoulder in the direction the shots had come from, making a larger target of himself, the sort of stupid calculation good men make when they've been bad for too long. We fell back in a half-crawl, half-crouch that felt like a childhood game having an affair with a war. The BIM ranger kept her voice a thread, pulling people where she wanted them with the calm an animal recognizes as the opposite of fear. The deputy with the kind eyes did a count under his breath. 1, 2, 3, as if making sure his numbers still loved him. Behind us, Dawson had a choice: rush the sleeve and be the face that the body cams loved, or retreat into the dark and be the rumor tomorrow would wear like cologne. He hesitated long enough to tell me he would regret whichever he chose. Then the ridge decided for him. A low, unconvincing growl came from upriver. Not thunder, not engine. The sound the desert makes when water in another county has already made its mind about you. The delayed wall of floodwater rounded the bend where the wash narrowed and showed us its teeth. It wasn't the first wave. This one had stolen other floods on its way. It was fat with other counties' regrets: mesquite trunks, a cooler that needed a better latch, a fence post with a coil of barbed wire attached, and a horned cow skull riding it like a captain. "Back," Ranger Ibarra said louder, the thread becoming a rope. "Everybody up and back. Leave it. Back now." The wave took the toe of the light and then took the light like it had paid for it. Water hit the edge of the sleeve and loved it sideways. The backhoe, parked on what had been the sensible side of the wash 10 minutes ago, shifted its weight, thought about grace, and then remembered it was a machine. It slid. It didn't flip. It did the slow, awful thing where heavy decides to be a lesson. Its bucket swung and then dipped and kissed the gravel right where the sleeve's rim had been a second before, and the sleeve gave an offended cough. The cap hopped once and slid off like a coin leaving a table. We were on the shelf above by then, breath tearing our throats up, boots finding choices they hadn't been promised. The flood took the first stainless crumb and shimmied it until it thought it was a boat. It wasn't. It tipped, burped out one bar like a tongue, and then spun in place like a wheel that didn't know what to do with itself. The bar rode the surface for a ridiculous, physics-denying second, flashed dull and heavy in the red-blue disco, and sank like a joke that had heard enough laughter. The body cam saw it. They caught the bar and the stamp and the ground-off mark and the thin curl of mylar that tried to come with it and failed. They caught Dawson's face when his knight did the thing a knight does when money remembers it is not loyal. They caught me, I'm sure, with my mouth open and my hands out like I could catch water. "Back," the ranger said again, and this time the flood added its own emphasis by pulling the ground out from under where we had just been with the casual malice only gravity can muster. We made the culvert mouth as a unit that hadn't earned the word but borrowed it on good faith. We funneled in, the deputy, the ranger, Tony, me, 2 CSI techs who were both too young to be this tired, Cole last, shoulders filling the cut like the door to a different world had been made to his measurements and then given to us all. The water went where it wanted to, and where it wanted to was over the sleeve, through the tools, into the backhoe's innards, and then out past the culvert like paperwork.
For a long minute, all we could do was breathe and let the wash talk. The flood hammered the culvert's mouth like a drummer who had forgotten to be polite, then dropped a notch, then another, remembering the night wasn't just about it.
We lock this down and we come back at first light, Ranger Ibarra said finally, voice rough with the performance she'd just given. We leave a unit. We set game cams. We make calls in the morning that annoy people in suits. Nobody digs, nobody touches. Nobody invents a new story while the old one is still telling itself. Dawson's voice drifted from the dark behind us, careful to sound reasonable. Ranger, deputy, I think we're all after the same thing here. Safety, order. There's no need to escalate. Sir, the deputy said, the word not so much an honorific as a lid. If you or your men are still on this property in 60 seconds, you're going to meet my supervisor's pen. You won't like how he spells your name. Cole breathed out through his nose. It sounded like a man who'd been holding his breath for years and was practicing the alternative. The flood slid off the pitch of event into aftermath. Rocks that had been loud settled, embarrassed. The backhoe leaned like a drunk considering sitting down. The sleeve disappeared under silt and new opinions. Juniper? Tony said, low. You okay? Yes, I said, and my voice surprised me by being true. I'm okay. We came out of the culvert into a world that had been briefly rearranged and had taken notes. The deputies set a perimeter of uglier tape. The ranger placed a game cam with a little smile, like a trick she'd been wanting to use. The CSI team packed what evidence they could with the tenderness you reserve for fragments of whatever you worship. Dawson and his bored lieutenant melted back to their SUV, their drone tucked under the lieutenant's arm like a child he'd been told to carry properly or else. Cole stood for a second like a man at a bus stop whose route had been canceled. He looked at me, then at the sleeve's new mud-brown absence, then back at me. For what it's worth, he said, I told him not to bring the backhoe. For what it's worth, I said, I told him not to come at all. He nodded, accepting the exchange rate, and walked into the half-light where a person like him had to make friends with other people's mornings. The deputy, the one with the kind eyes, tugged his hat brim, turned off his body cam with exaggerated ceremony, and looked at me human. Miss Boss, he said, tomorrow's going to be loud. I don't mind loud. I mind wrong. He smiled. Good, because loud is what makes wrong explain itself. 3 up top, the perimeter deputy said. Moved around before dawn. One looked like he regretted leg day. Let them watch, Ibarra said. Sometimes watching is the only sport they're good at. We dug. This time, the earth gave itself back willingly, like it had decided to stop protecting the old plan and start protecting the new one. The drum we'd seen tip last night was now throat deep in silt, ring glinting like a secret that wanted to be told, but wanted you to earn it. We levered it upright with straps and a come-along and the kind of language mechanics use to encourage machinery to make better choices. Ready? The tech asked, scalpel hovering at the Mylar's corner again. Ready, Tony said. Cameras on. They slit and revealed a layer we hadn't seen. Under the bars, under A2, A3, was a false bottom cut from aluminum thin enough to trick you unless you knew how to look. The tech teased a corner up with a gloved fingernail. Under it, not metal, paper. A book, bound in canvas, zippered. The kind you give to a person you love if you plan to leave for a long time. He lifted it out. The cameras leaned in, hungry. The ranger took a step closer. I forgot how to swallow. Tony breathed the way a diver does before she finally goes under to see something for herself. The tech unzipped the canvas and opened the book. Inside, a sheaf of documents, on blue Swallow Motel stationery, handwritten columns of coordinates and dates and initials that matched the ledger, a map sketched by a careful hand that had loved rulers, and a single Polaroid laid on top, like an apology. In the picture, a man I didn't know, standing where I was standing, 30 years younger, holding a bar across his 2 hands like a newborn.
Beside him, a teenage boy who had the kind of eyes that memorize and the kind of mouth that tells other men they can go ahead and be loud. The boy had a name stitched on his work shirt. Cole.